So the SFI newsletter said that the talk tonight is called Ahimsa, the ethical backbone of our practice. So the word Ahimsa it's an old and ancient, really Indian term or principle that is about nonviolence. And in the context of Buddhist teaching, that principle of nonviolence becomes the teaching of what's called sila, S-I-L-A. And sila means something like ethics or morality or virtue. And I have been talking about it a lot because when I look around in the world, it seems to me that it's one of the things that we need the most. And I'm also aware that for many people who, especially Western convert Buddhists who come to practice the Dharma, there can be a bit of a, how would I say, kind of a cringe almost, right? When we talk about ethics and morality, because there's such an overlay in Western culture of a kind of almost punitive tone to ethics, sort of the slap on the wrist, a sense of restraint, a sense of getting punished for doing something bad, right? And I think it's really important to understand that in the context of Buddhist teaching, it's very, very different. That sila, ethics, is really, it's interesting, I said it's the backbone of our practice. I think of it very much as heart practice. Ethical practice, sila, which is the heart of the Eightfold Noble Path, wise action, wise speech, and wise livelihood. That's the basket that's referred to as sila. It's all about relationship. It's all about what I've been calling lately, how we can live together well. And it seems to me that we're doing a pretty bad job of that right about now. And so maybe if we can kind of get over the overlay that many of us have of, kind of the Western religion, original sin version of morality, and take up the perspective of Buddhist teaching, which is the opposite of original sin. It's actually, from a Buddhist perspective, we don't start from having an internal flaw. We start from a place of what's sometimes called basic goodness, or our fundamental Buddha nature. That who we are in our essence isn't a flawed human that needs repair or redemption. What we are at our core is good. And the reason that we behave the way we do, which doesn't always look so good, isn't because we're bad, it's because we're confused. And this is why sometimes Buddhism is referred to as a wisdom path. So the wisdom is about seeing clearly who we really are and what the world really is, so that we behave in a way. And sila is all about behavior, so that we behave in a way that the key phrase is do no harm, that does no harm. And probably you can tell just from saying those words out loud that it sounds simple, and it's not, right? I've often talked about this arc of karma. Karma means action. We're talking about sila, has to do with the actions of body, speech, and mind. And the arc of karma includes our intention, which is why the intention behind what we do or say. It includes the action, the speaking or acting, engaging, and then it includes the impact. And very often, the intention and the impact are at odds, right? So it's not, sila doesn't mean that we have to get it right all the time or that we have to do everything perfectly. And it doesn't even mean that we don't do harm, because we will. What it means is we do our best. We do our best to intend not to do harm, which is at the front end of this arc of karma. We stay awake as we're engaging to notice the impact of what's happening. And if we discover that we've done harm, then we can go in and correct. We can say we're sorry. We can ask for forgiveness. We can adapt and shift our behavior. And in this way, we put ourselves in this kind of ongoing loop of becoming more and more skillful at doing no harm. So sila, as I said, is the center of the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is the fourth step of the Four Noble Truths. And I'm telling you this because some of you may have noticed, if you listen to lots of Buddhist talks, that there are lots of numbered lists, right? There are the three poisons and the three characteristics and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the six paramis. And the reason for that is because Buddhism was an oral tradition for a long time. And so the way that it was passed down was through these lists that were easy to memorize, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as I was thinking about that the last few days, it occurred to me that that was a good process for making sure that the information got passed along. Like, here's the content of the Four Noble Truths. Here's the content of the Eightfold Path. But what's missing is the context. And that's ours to clarify for ourselves. So why was it that the Buddha taught that there's suffering, there's a cause of suffering, there's the possibility of freedom, and there's a path for realizing that freedom? Those are the Four Noble Truths. You could probably guess that he himself experienced some suffering. And I think it's important to recognize that the time of the Buddha was quite difficult. It was difficult in ways that are similar to the difficulties we're facing today and also quite different, right? So probably at the time of the Buddha, he wasn't worried about climate catastrophe. He probably didn't have, an overflowing inbox of email. There was no social media. There was no AI, right? So there are unique situations that we're facing now that are different from the time of the Buddha 2,600 years ago. But there's also parts of it that are the same. There's that phrase in French that says something like, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that's because human beings are human beings, right? And there's a teaching in Buddhism called the Wheel of Life. And it's kind of a version of Buddhist cosmology. And at the center of the wheel is what we call the three poisons. Greed, another list, right? 3. Greed, hatred, and delusion. And this is understood to be kind of the normal reactive mode for us as human beings. And out of that reactivity comes, dukkha, all the trouble that we face. And sila is an invitation to not live in reactivity. Sila is an invitation to live with greater intentionality instead of reacting to whatever's happening. We clarify for ourselves what matters most, what we care about. And then we take up these ethical principles to allow us to align with what matters. And again, the overarching, or sometimes we say the underlying principle, is do no harm. And then that do no harm has these different flavors, 5 basic flavors, which are described as the Buddhist precepts. I'm checking to see if there's anything else I wanted to say there. So the precepts are a kind of explication of how to do no harm. And again, I want to say, because I think as soon as we start talking about ethics and principles, very quickly we take it in as a kind of restrictive, do not punitive set of, what do you call them? Admonitions, right? But I want to share a story that I think helps reorient the way we may think about this. Not so much as how to keep ourselves in line, but more how to align ourselves with how we want to be, who we want to be, how we want to show up in a way that comes from compassion, that comes from looking out at the trouble in the world and saying, I don't want to make things worse. I don't want to continue turning the wheel of samsara through greed, hatred, and delusion, right? I want to do my best to step off that wheel and do something different. So there's this great story about Nelson Mandela, who I'm sure many of you know about, who he spent many years fighting apartheid in South Africa and spent many, many years in prison as a result of his efforts. And at the end of that period of time, 27 years actually in prison, he became the first president of South Africa and the first South African person to lead the government. So pretty extraordinary transformation of events from a country that was for many, many years functioned in one way and then came to function in a different way. Now, if you know the current history of South Africa, that wasn't the end of the story. This is part of what we see in the cycles of history, that things can get really, really bad, and then they can get much, much better, and then they often go back around, right? I've been thinking about this because well, 2 things come to mind. One is, in my lifetime, mostly, which is not to say that things haven't been difficult, but mostly the world that I've inhabited has been a world that has been opening, less divisive, more inclusive. In my lifetime, we've had civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and like that. And for me, the joy of, the Pride Parade here in San Francisco today is an expression of that. But there's almost always a backlash. And it seems as if that's current, that's happening now, right? That there's a rolling back, you know, there's a rolling back of women's rights, there's a rolling back of voting rights, there's a rolling back of gay rights, right? And so when we're in this situation looking at like, yikes, this is the time that it's really important to line ourselves up with what matters, to get as clear as we can about where we stand so that we don't just get swept, you know? Okay, so all that was backdrop to this story about Mandela. So the story is that after he was released from prison and had become the president, he was with his entourage, which basically means him and a bunch of bodyguards at a restaurant. And there was a man at the restaurant, and Mandela asked the guards to ask this guy to come and sit with them. And the guy came and sat with the president and his bodyguards, and he was visibly distressed. He was shaking and sweating, and he didn't say a word. And Mandela didn't say anything to him either. Anyway, when they were done, the guy left, and one of the guards said to Mandela, that man looked like he was in a lot of distress. He must have been sick or ailing or something. And Mandela said, no, that man was one of my guards when I was on Robben Island. And after I was beaten while I was in prison, I would call out and ask the guards for, please, just a little bit of water. And that man would come and urinate on my head. He said the reason that he was shaking and sweating that way was because he thought that I was going to retaliate. He thought that I was going to take revenge now that I'm in the position of power and he's not. And he said, but that is not my ethics. That is not my character. Such a powerful story, right? Because all of us will be in situations where we just want to hit back. Taking up sila, taking up this basic precept of not doing harm, is an opportunity to cut that karmic chain of harm, to say, no, I'm not going to perpetuate what happened to me to those who come after me. I like to say it as like the karma stops here, no more. And will we do that perfectly? No. I think Nelson Mandela was a bit of a saint, you know. Maybe we won't be able to do it exactly like he did, or you know, in as profound a way as he did. But each of us taking up, you know, a vow to do no harm, a vow to align ourselves with ethics of non-harming rather than perpetuating negative karma is, well, I'll say it this way. For me, it allows me to feel like there is something I can do in the midst of the kinds of crises all around that so often feel overwhelming, right? So easy to feel helpless, hopeless. So when we take up this dimension of Buddhist practice, this sila and ethics, which in some ways has been, I think, very much sidelined in the context of, again, Western convert Buddhism. We like meditating. We may like reading interesting texts or going and listening to Dharma talks, but ethics? In much of the time that I've spent in the Insight tradition, the only time that ethics was even mentioned was, at the beginning of a retreat. You do a recitation of the precepts, and that was it. So it gets this much airplay, and it feels like it could use quite a bit more at this moment for two reasons. One is that, as I've been talking about, when we take up ethics, we have an opportunity to stay in alignment, to find a kind of compass in the midst of churn. And there's quite a bit of churn, which keeps getting turned up, both by the circumstances, but also just by the bombardment of media and social media, right? The second reason, which for me feels really important, is that it gives us a way to practice in our daily lives. Many of us come to practice because we like sitting and being quiet. Or maybe we don't like it, but we discovered that it's actually really helpful. Right? So we take up a meditative practice and it is helpful. Right? It's super useful in many, many ways. But often I find people ask, and when I get off the cushion, now what? Like, yes, sitting off the cushion is a metaphor, whether you sit on a cushion or not. But when I stop meditating, how do I apply what I do, especially for those folks who go on retreat? At the end of retreat, people are always asking, how do I take this home? Right? And I don't think we figured that out very well yet, we Western convert Buddhists. But I feel like this set of teachings that is sila is one of the ways that we can do that. One of the ways that we can really thread our practice through our lives, because sila is what shows up in relationship, in conversation, in like that at this moment. So we'll close with traditional dedication, which is a practice of generosity, of dana. So if you'll close your eyes for a moment. And take a nice deep breath. And just noticing, feeling into whatever may have been touched or evoked, inspired in you from our time together this evening. And in the spirit of generosity, we offer up, we open our hands, we open our hearts, and share any goodness, any benefit, any merit that may have come from our gathering together this evening for the benefit of all beings everywhere. By the power and truth of our practice together this evening, may all beings be happy and peaceful. May all beings be safe and free from harm. May all beings live with ease. And may we all awaken to the truth and beauty of who and what we really are. Thank you all, friends. Please take good care of yourselves.